Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be speaking about something very significant for us to understand in order to be happy and successful in life. Life is born out of love. A baby is created when there is love. And when the child is born, it has absolutely no sense of self. In other words, it does not have an ego. But as the baby begins to grow, the human beings around the child start to give the baby a name. They start to condition the child with that name and start to give it an identity. They begin to teach the child various lessons about the world around and also begin to tell the child stories, and through stories give the child a set of beliefs, a set of values and something to imagine. And through all of the conditioning, the child gets a reinforcement and begins to form a sense of self, what is called as the ego. And as the child grows into a young teenager, it begins to question itself whether the world outside is complex, whether the world outside is something that it can easily understand. And as a teenager, there is a whole lot of confusion in the young teenager's mind. The internal world is turbulent and the external world is giving the teenager a lot of confusing messages. They're not really clear of what was told to them is the right way versus what they observe in the real world. There seems to be a difference. And as the teenager grows into an adult with all of these confusions in one mind, the sense of self goes through a series of changes and gets further reinforced with a lot of conditioning. Some of it is useful conditioning, but a whole lot of it is preventing the young adult from exploring all the possibilities of his or her life. Why is that? This is something that we have to reflect on. So, what I propose to share with you today, I have put together what I call as the love all, serve all framework. And we're going to be discussing three major concepts from life experience, and at various points I am sure you will be able to resonate with the stories that I am going to tell you. First, let's talk about Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is a very popular psychologist who devoted his career in psychology in building the most fundamental concepts and theories based on which psychology and psychological studies were developed after him. One of the key statements that he made was, "Where id is, there shall ego be." Where id is, there shall ego be. So he gave a model of the human mind, and broadly he explained that what we know about ourselves and others, he called it the ego. the sense of self. And he said that this is a very small and superficial part of human existence, of our sense of being. But there is a complete unknown which is vast, and he called it the id, or the subconscious. And he said a lot of the roots of our experience of life and the way we derive meaning from the experience of life is deeply rooted within id, or the subconscious. So, there are two parts to our mind. One is the conscious part, what is called as the sense of self or ego, and what we think we are. That is what the ego is. And id, which is the subconscious part. And what he meant by saying, where id is, there shall ego be, is that in the journey of human growth and evolution, one day human beings will realize the unknown part or the subconscious part of their mind. They will have awareness, and the ego will expand to include things that currently people do not understand. And as we increase our awareness, what is unknown will become known. And there is a lot of progress to be made in gaining that understanding. So, this is something that we need to keep in mind as a base to our discussion. And what I want to present to you over here is, let's consider ego, that is a sense of self, which is represented by 1 or I, and divide that by a null value or 0. That means if we have a 0 ego state where we don't have a sense of self, then as in mathematics, this would tend towards infinity. Of course, the purists in mathematicians will say this is not appropriate, but let us take some poetic freedom in order to understand this metaphor. So, an egotistic state divided by a no ego state will give us an infinite energy. Infinite energy. Why and how is that? And in order to understand why we can achieve infinite energy if we focus towards reducing our sense of self and looking at the bigger picture, we need to move to the next concept. And the third concept we need to understand today is what I call as an I for life. Developing a mindful I. So here's a word pun, I as in I, the ego, as well as I, the visual organ. So as designed by nature, our eye is the most beautiful camera ever made and the most intelligent camera ever made, because it can spontaneously zoom in and zoom out almost effortlessly in order for you to capture and perceive whatever it is in the external world. Right? So, let's take that as an example in order to understand our sense of self. So, if you look at the human eye, we have a lens, and the lens apparatus has an opening which is called as the aperture. The aperture is the opening through which light flows in through the lens, and then the image is formed on the retina. Very simply put. Now, if you increase the size of the aperture or you decrease the size of the aperture, we call that process as zooming in and zooming out. We zoom in and zoom out. So when the lens is zoomed in, the aperture is narrow, therefore you perceive only objects which are smaller in size. In other words, your view is restricted. And when the aperture is broad or large, you zoom out, you're able to see a bigger picture, you get a broader view, and you get limitless views. You can see far and beyond, and therefore you capture a lot more of what's in the external world. So similarly, if you look at the ego state, if we consider ourselves to be everything and the whole world is revolving around ourselves, which is called a self-centered ego state, then we get a very narrow view of reality. In fact, we are creating a very narrow perception of reality, and we are basing our decisions, our emotions are all coming from that state, a very narrow state, which is a lot of the time causing problems, suffering, misery, delusions, and in the business world, it leads to a lot of unproductivity and negative outcomes. And leaders need to balance between being self-centered and selfless. When you zoom out, you are considering everybody around you. You are more in a selfless state, and therefore you're able to see the bigger picture. And because you're able to see the bigger picture and relate it to the narrow picture that you previously saw, simultaneously balancing the views, you're able to arrive at a more equitable decision, which is not necessarily based only on your narrow views. And that is how, going back to this equation, I divided by a null state 0 or egoless state or a selfless state, you can get infinite energy. And you have experienced this in your life almost on a daily basis. If you care to be aware of it, reflect on it. Whenever you pursued anything only for your interest, it did not get you much energy. You felt very tired. But look at all the people in the world who are working selflessly, tirelessly. Many examples around you. They have loads and loads of energy. From where do they get that? Definitely not just from food, and definitely not from sleep, because they don't get to sleep much. Because they are in a selfless state. Their aperture is wide. They're thinking about everybody else around them. They're able to see more clearly. And that is why we say in Hindi, darshan karo, see clearly and listen to understand deeply. You can see clearly and listen to understand deeply if you are not focused, if your aperture is not having a narrow lens view. You're taking the entire picture, both the big and the small, together, simultaneously, effortlessly, and in a natural manner. Because your system is already designed. Nature has already designed you to be that way. It's only our conditioning and a misunderstanding of ourselves which put us into an extreme state of ego, where we think we need to protect ourselves from the dangers around, where we think we need to accumulate and amass things because we would need things for the future, resources for the future, which is again perceived with a lot of fear. And it's not necessarily a positive spiral. Whereas if we have a more balanced view, zooming in and zooming out in a natural way and being open to all possibilities, then we can access infinite amount of energy and take the appropriate insight, act on the appropriate insight wisely to make sure that the outcomes are beneficial to everyone around us as well as ourselves. So, this is a very important and fundamental aspect of life which we must consider and we must grow from within in order to experience the happy and joyful state that we already have within ourselves. We don't need much to be happy and joyful. In a natural way, children are already that. They don't have to do much. But we tend to pursue things and force ourselves sometimes to be happy, sometimes to achieve things purely driven out of a very high self-centered state of mind or an egotistic state of mind, an individualistic state of mind. It is not necessarily a wrong approach, but a balance is required. We need to keep the balance between the I and the we and make sure that we are acting out of wisdom, keeping our lens, the aperture of our lens, zooming in and zooming out in a natural manner. I hope this session resonated and gave you some insights. I enjoyed presenting this to you. Thank you.